This segment of Delmarva Life is brought to you by the Cape May Lewis Ferry.
Welcome back to Delmarva Life. Did you know a town as old as Lewis is said to have spirits of some of the original residents? That's why the Lewis Historical Society offers haunted tours. Many of the ghost stories come from about a 3-block area in the heart of town, like the Cannonball House. Professional ghost hunters have visited many of the sites. A lot of what they picked up with their cameras and meters was deemed unexplainable. Haunted tours are usually offered in the fall around Halloween. Lewis also played a big role in World War II. Now, although the United States never had a site that was significant for battle, we were ready, especially here on Delmarva. When you drive on Route 1 along the Delaware coast, it's hard to miss these concrete towers. There's 11 of them up and down the coast, and although they may seem pretty random, they played a huge role in protecting Delmarva and the mouth of the Delaware Bay during World War II.
Construction started even before the United States was involved in World War II, mainly because the United States realized there was going to be a threat, and the Port of Philadelphia was very important. DuPont foundries were making black powder, as well as nylon was being produced by DuPont.
Sean Heacock is the historic site manager at Fort Miles in Sussex County, which was home to the 261st Coast Artillery.
By the end of about 1943, 1944, there were 23 major caliber weapons here, 12-inch, 16-inch, 6-inch, large guns, ready to protect the Delaware Bay, as well as the entire minefield that was out in the bay to protect everything.
The fire control towers were set up as baselines to triangulate the position of suspicious ships or U-boats.
They are what aimed these guns, more or less.
When an enemy ship was detected, information about the ship's position was phoned from the towers to the plotting room.
This is where the brains would do the work, the brains of Fort Miles, so this would be in the plotting room. Basically, you have one arm representing one tower, and they see a ship at 255 degrees. And you have another arm representing another tower. They see the ship at 310 degrees.
Creating a triangle to which the guns would aim.
That ship, in about 30 seconds, will be at this point at this range.
Fortunately, few ships came close to the Delaware coastline, but Fort Miles was ready.
For the most part, they did a lot of practicing here. They lived all throughout this entire Cape Henlopen State Park. There are barrack buildings strategically placed, so the men would be on roughly 2 to 3 minute readiness, so that if something happened, they could be at their gun batteries within 2 to 3 minutes.
There was some underwater traffic.
They did have the submarine threat, the U-boat threat, but that was, the minefields were the big defender against that. These guns aren't designed to shoot against an underwater targets.
At its peak, these barracks housed more than 2,000 soldiers, but eventually the threat from Germany diminished.
This base ended up being very calm. The German Navy, the Tirpitz and the Bismarck, the two big German battleships, by about 1942 were out of commission. So what this base was built to defend against wasn't coming. So it was just practice at that point, just in case something else did show up.
The Army and the Navy continued to use Fort Miles for various purposes. The Navy used a portion of the base for Cold War spying.
The Army and the Navy did not fully give up rights to this site until about 1996, but mid-50s, they started converting it over to a recreational post. So people from Fort Meade or soldiers from Fort Meade, could come over and stay in the barrack buildings here and go on a nice vacation.
And in 2004, it was officially put on the National Historic Registry. Today, efforts are being made to turn Fort Miles into a museum. The original gun that sat in this building is long gone, but replacements are being found around the country. And recently, a 16-inch gun barrel from the USS Missouri made its way to Delmarva.
Fort Miles Historic Association raised about $140,000 to move that 16-inch gun barrel from the USS Missouri, and it started off on a barge. Then it was placed on a rail car, which brought it all the way in through Lewis and out to the Barcroft plant right out here. Then loaded onto a 96-wheel trailer, crawled it into the park, and finally unloaded. That gun barrel weighs a little more than 200 tons. So the transportation costs and the permitting and the infrastructure to carry that much weight is a challenge to work around.
In fact, Sean thinks it's the exact barrel that General Douglas MacArthur stood under during the signing of the Japanese surrender. Sean says a lot of people hear the stories of battles in Europe, and now it's time to tell the stories of what happened on the home front.
This building is in the process of being converted into a museum. So, and the long-term goal is to renovate this building to the point that we can house exhibits and house all of the information telling the story of Fort Miles, telling the World War II story, clear through. So, in the future, hopefully this building will be set up that way, and school children will be able to come in here and learn about, learn about science and math through the lens of history, and really help make this place a little bit more known.
A story that answers the question, what if? Well, one German U-boat did surrender and was taken to Fort Miles. In May of 1945, the U-858 was escorted to Fort Miles. 57 sailors were sent to Fort DuPont near Wilmington. They were later set free. Many of the German sailors decided to stay in the United States. Brian?
Lisa, Lewis is home to one of Delaware's most famous shipwrecks. The DeBrock sank off the shore in the late 18th century. Now one museum lets people come inside and take a look at the artifacts that were on board that ship, and also get an up-close look at the wreck itself.
Take one look at the Zwannendale Museum in Lewis, and you'll see why it stands out.
A lot of people do think that it is a church, but it was actually built as a museum. It was built in 1931, 300 years after the Dutch arrived here in 1631.
Bridget Warner is the site supervisor for the Zwannendale Museum. Since the area of Lewis was first discovered by the Dutch, Bridget says the building is patterned after the town hall of Hoorn, which is in the Netherlands.
When you go outside, if you look on top of the building, the guy on top of the building is David Peter de Vries. He was from Hoorn, Holland. He was the patroon or the money guy for that first group of settlers that came here in 1631.
There are many exhibits inside the museum, but one of the newest showcases artifacts from the DeBrock, a British Royal Navy ship that sank off the coast of Delaware more than 200 years ago.
You have several display cases here inside the museum of artifacts and items that were sort of pulled from the shipwreck. Explain what's in this display case here.
This case contains artifacts that depict what the officers would have used on board ship. And for the most part, these items are a bit finer quality than the enlisted men would have had. One of the most interesting artifacts, I think, is this condiment bottle here. This is a bottle that contained ketchup. Not like the ketchup that we would have today. This ketchup would have been made from anchovies, mushrooms, spices, mixed with some stale beer. Not a very palatable flavor, I wouldn't imagine.
No, it doesn't sound good at all.
What makes the story of the DeBrock so unique? This is one of those instances where not only do you get to see the artifacts and read the stories, you can also see the shipwreck up close. That's because it's not too far away at Cape Henlopen State Park.
All right, so here she is. Explain what we're looking at here.
What you're seeing here is the remnant of the DeBrock's hull. And to orient you, you're seeing the left side, or the port side.
Charles Fithian is an archaeologist for the Delaware State Museums. He's been working with the DeBrock for the last 26 years.
She gives us a glimpse into the human experience at sea that we cannot get any other way.
The DeBrock was part of a class of ships known as sloops of war. The Royal Navy used them all over the world to protect British territories and commerce.
They can be very powerful. DeBrock's firepower amounted to about 16 guns that had a total broadside weight of 348 pounds. That's a lot of iron flying away from the ship should her guns go into action. So they combined that with speed, agility, shallow draft, and it made them a very powerful ship. She was entirely constructed of oak. We have done a wood map of the hull, and we do see some other more unusual woods get used in places, but they're mainly repairs.
Charles says in May of 1798, the DeBrock was protecting commerce ships in the Atlantic Ocean. It had gotten separated from the convoy after going after an unidentified ship.
She was in the process of working her way back up the coast of the United States and arrived in the Delaware Bay at 4 o'clock in the afternoon on May 25th. And at that point, a storm was brewing and struck the vessel and caused the vessel to capsize and sink. We know from the historical record that about 35 of her crew were lost out of a crew contingent of 86.
The British made attempts to salvage the ship months later, but failed. Fast forward to 1984, treasure hunters located the ship and began bringing artifacts to the surface. Charles was there in 1986 when the Dubrock was loosened from the mud and sand and raised from the water.
A project like this is very complex in terms of its conservation. You have artifacts that have sat on the sea floor for nearly 2 centuries, and they've become, in some cases, destabilized. Other ones are extraordinarily well preserved.
In the early 1990s, Dubrock came to where it now sits, inside this storage building. Sprinklers come on several times a day, which is important to keep what's left intact.
The spray right now keeps the timbers of the hull wet. If we did not do that, what you would have is uncontrolled drying. The cell walls would collapse because they're filled with water, and she would literally fall apart in a matter of weeks.
And keeping the Dubrock together is crucial.
Of the various sloops of war that the British had, this is the only one that we actually have. They lost many of them during the course of the wars with Revolutionary France and then Napoleon. But of that group, this is the only one that has been recovered to date and that we have direct information from.
This is not Dubrock's final resting place. Charles says he and others are still trying to figure out a way to preserve the boat forever.
What will work for one project is not an automatic fit for another. So what we have to come up with is going to have to be very tailored to the Dubrock and its specific needs.
When that will happen is still unknown, an unknown that remains near and dear to Charles. As a young boy, he always had a fascination with American and British naval ships.
So to be able to work on one of them was an unexpected professional treat. When I started out in archaeology, I never figured I would be involved in it. And when I got involved with this project, it was pretty exciting.
For now, Charles and those at the Zwannendaele Museum will continue to focus on educating and preserving, all in the name of the Dubrock.
And here's a little fact. The name Zwannendaele means Valley of the Swans in Dutch. Well, still to come on Delmarva Life. Now that we've learned about some of Lewis's heritage, it's time to move across the bay to learn more about the history of Cape May. From early settlers to wealthy vacationers to a 20th century Renaissance, we have a look back at what made this town what it is today. Plus, a little later, we'll meet some of Cape May's famous faces when we visit the Cape May County Park and Zoo. And for many families, summer just wouldn't be the same without a trip to the boardwalk. Up next, we check out the amusement piers at the Wildwoods and show you why it did not disappoint.
It happened so fast. Okay, everyone's still... We're okay. I was okay.
Delmarva Life, the Cape May Lewis Ferry Edition will be right back.